Okay, welcome everybody, and welcome Stephen Stanko from the UDAF Department of Agriculture and Food. Let's hear from you what we're going to be hearing about today.
Hi, thanks for having me, Sophie. So today we're going to hear about the threats that are facing Utah's honeybees as well as Utah's native bees, and some things that the average person, the average citizen of Utah can do to help address those issues.
Right on.
All right, so let's dive right into it. So just a little bit of a history on our program here at Utah Department of Agriculture and Food. So Utah was actually a pioneer in honeybee health. We were actually the very first apiary program ever organized in the United States. It was actually before Utah was a state. So our program actually predates the state. It was the territorial legislature that passed the first bee law back in 1892 when this guy here, Professor A.J. Cook, came from Michigan Agricultural College, which you may know as Michigan State today. And he was actually brought out here due to an outbreak of a disease called American Foulbrood that was very serious in the territory at the time. And honey was one of the few cheap sources of sugar that they had. They could get sugar by rail, however, that was quite expensive. And so as American Foulbrood ravaged the hives in the territory, the supply of sugar was cut down. And so the territorial legislature brought Professor A.J. Cook out to deal with that. And he organized our program as well as the Utah Beekeepers Association, which is still functional today. So we're proud to be part of that history. Okay,
Nice.
So now getting on to the topic at hand. One thing that I do like to point out with my talks is that bees aren't the only pollinators out there. And we hear a whole awful lot about bees and particularly about honeybees, but it's important to remember that they're not the only ones carrying the burden of pollinating all of our flowering plants. We do have things like hoverflies, which you'll see right up here, which cleverly mimic honeybees and wasps to avoid predation. Here we have some ants on some spurge. Down here we have a red-necked false blister beetle. He's from a family of pollen-feeding beetles. Here you can see what looks like a hummingbird, but it's not. It's actually a clear-winged moth. You'll see these around Utah somewhat frequently.
Yeah, so these are other ideas for pollinators for the pollinator costume contest as well.
Exactly, yeah. Extra points to anyone who pulls off the red-necked false blister beetle.
Yeah, that's exactly the one I was thinking about.
So one thing that does come up a lot is why is there all this focus on bees? Why is everyone talking about bees? And that's because bees are the most efficient insect pollinators that we have. Around the mid-Cretaceous period, we saw an explosion in angiosperms, which are flowering plants. And part of the reason that they've been so successful is because they have a very efficient mating strategy through insect pollination, namely through bees. So bees and flowering plants literally evolved alongside one another. They are literally made for each other. One thing I also like to point out as I get started with talks is what is and is not a bee. There seems to be a good bit of confusion about that. So as you saw on that first slide, here's another hoverfly. They are not bees, they are in fact flies. So they do look a lot like bees. One thing that's a dead giveaway is that hoverflies only have one set of wings, whereas the bees have two sets of wings. They have a forewing and a hind wing, whereas the flies only have a forewing.
Yeah, those sneaky fly wings. I can totally see that. Huh.
Yeah. Also, what is not a bee are these here, which this is a bald-faced hornet's nest. And you'll see these around Utah. They're very common. In fact, I have a nest hanging up behind me right now. And then another thing, I actually took this picture in Cabela's. And if you look down here, you'll actually see it says black bear with a beehive. That is actually not a beehive at all. That's a European hornet's nest. So this bear is going to be very disappointed. He's not going to find any honey in that hive. Same with Pooh Bear here. This is not what a beehive would look like in the wild. So both Pooh Bear and this bear here can be really disappointed once they break into those nests.
That's so funny. I had no idea.
Yeah.
So hornets don't make honey. They just live in their hive.
Nope, they don't make any honey at all. And for the Always Sunny fans out there, they would know that as well. So we do have here a picture of things that are beehives, but aren't really what you'll see as far as modern hives. And one of those you'll recognize as their state symbol, which this is a skep hive. It's an older style of hive design. It's a lot less efficient than modern designs and doesn't allow for honey to be easily harvested without harming the colony. So it's fallen out of favor. And actually, for disease management reasons, you're not allowed to keep skep hives in the state anymore. But that's okay because they're not very good hives to keep bees in anyway. We've come up with better options, and I'll show you that here in a second. And this is actually another photo I took. This is a feral colony here in Salt Lake County that actually got away, and this is what a colony looks like when it's established just out in nature. Now, unfortunately, this did not make it because they were too exposed, but in any sort of rocky area throughout Utah, you're liable to run across feral colonies just like this. So modern hives. Modern hives are most typically using a Langstroth hive. They were invented back in the 1800s by a guy, believe it or not, by the name of Langstroth. And the system works off of these supers or boxes, and the box contains frames, and each frame holds a sheet of comb. And the bees draw out their comb off of that, and the honeycomb is where they raise their brood, where they store their pollen, and also where they make the honey. So let's talk about bees in agriculture. Obviously, bees are particularly honey bees are super important for pollinating our crops. So here in Utah, bees handle pollination with everything from apples, apricots, peaches, melons, blackberries, blueberries, etc. And they're a vital portion of our specialty crop industry here in Utah, which specialty crops are fruits, nuts, and vegetables, which many of those either need bee pollination in order to set a fruit, or will have better yields or larger fruit if they're efficiently.
And are they just pollinated by honeybees? Why specifically honeybees? Because from going through Bee Fest, everyone's been been kind of reiterating that native bees are a bit more efficient at pollination, but honeybees, I guess, since they're cultivated, is it because they're more movable and people can move them to agricultural sites?
Yes, and it's also that with a lot of our native bees, they live in even the most social of our native bees, which would probably be our bumblebees, which have colonies that range up into a few hundred individuals at absolute most, and usually just a few tens of individuals for those nests. Whereas the honeybees will maintain a nest at full capacity is about 60,000 individuals, and the scale of pollination that's needed for modern agriculture is rather astounding. You'll get to see some of that here because while the native bees oftentimes on a flower basis are more efficient, the honeybees taken as a whole are much more efficient pollinators than native bees.
Right.
And honeybees account for about 80 to 90% of the pollination that's handled in the U.S. In agriculture, at least.
Wow. Gotcha.
And so as you can see here, actually, pollination is big business. We can actually see in this photo here, those are some hives being loaded up on a semi here in Utah to head out to California for pollination. And here you can see holding yards of honeybee hives. So each hive or each pallet has 4 hives on it, and the pallets are stacked 3 high on the semi, and then they're unloaded here in these holding yards, just 1 pallet high. And each one of these white dots that you see is 4 beehives, and you can see that they go on into the distance, and the scale is rather astounding.
Yeah.
And this is a picture of one of the almond orchards that many Utah beekeepers go to, and it's called South Valley Farms. Let me grab the exact figures here because I think it's really going to blow some people away. Just the scale at which this is occurring. So just to give you an idea, in this almond orchard, they have 17,000 acres of almonds. That's multiple square miles of almonds that are being grown there. Just in this one orchard, they actually have more acreage of orchard trees than the entire state of Utah. So that should blow your mind right there.
Yeah, that's pretty mind-blowing.
In order to efficiently pollinate this almond orchard, they need 2 hives per acre of almonds that they have, which means they need 34,000 hives in order to get all of these almonds pollinated.
Wow.
Each hive for almond pollination costs the farmer about $200. and he's going to need 34,000 of them. So it's going to be about $6.8 million is what this farm is going to pay out for pollination, which accounts for about 15 to 20% of the production cost for almonds, is actually paying beekeepers to bring in the bees for pollination, which that's about 84 semi-loads worth of bees that'll come to this orchard.
Wow.
And each semi-load is 408 hives. So pretty astounding, the scale that we're dealing with here.
Yeah.
One thing that may come up is people say, well, why don't we just break this out? But the difficulty with breaking down monocultures like these is that you don't get the efficiencies of scale, and it may actually turn out to be less efficient and less environmentally friendly to take these farms and break them out into tons of little small farms everywhere, because the degradation that goes on, that's just a necessary part of it, would be spread out versus consolidated into a single area. And not only that, I would be willing to bet that CO2 emissions are much, much lower in these larger farms than they would be if, we had tons and tons of little individual farms that were all buying equipment, using equipment independently, compared to if we had these large farms. So if you don't want big farms like these, then you should have stopped having kids a long time ago.
It's too late.
It's too late. And this is the system that honestly is most realistic. And for that reason, that's why we need our commercial beekeepers, because ultimately we are heavily reliant on these systems in order to provide the scale of food that everyone needs, particularly because U.S. appetites for those specialty crops, which is fruits, nuts, and vegetables, is on a year-over-year spike, basically, as people are more concerned about eating healthy, eating things that are fresh from the grocery store.
Yeah.
A lot of times that involves, as probably many of the viewers will know, lots of fruits, nuts, and vegetables. So what's killing the honeybees? That's the question that I maybe most often get. And for the honeybee problems, they can be broken down as the 4 Ps, which, as you'll see here, are pathogens, pesticides, poor nutrition, and parasites. Mm-hmm. And I've added Varroa mites here, and we'll talk a little bit more about them. But if you're looking for the single cause of honeybee declines, it is number one, without a doubt, Varroa mites that are the biggest contributor and the biggest issue that beekeepers deal with on a year-to-year basis.
Is that top photo?
That is that top photo, yeah. And we'll dive into Varroa mites just a little bit more, just because they're so important, and hopefully, viewers will get a better idea of what's at issue with these mites. First thing I'll talk about is one of the pathogens that we deal with, which is American Foulbrood, which you may recall from earlier on is a disease that the territory was dealing with and led to the creation of our aviary inspection program. And this is a bacterial infection that actually infects the honeybee larvae as they're developing and turns them into this ooey gooey bacterial soup. And you can see actually a picture here of what's called roping larva, and that's because the entire larva is consumed, and the bacteria in their vegetative state are these long rods. And what you're seeing here, because the reason it's so stretchy is because the bacteria are just sliding over one another, and so these long rods, they kind of hold on to each other, make this long, ropey, goopy grossness. And so that is something that we work with beekeepers to control, and we target the prevalence rate for that in the state below 1%, which means that more AFB is being found and destroyed than is being created. Unfortunately, in the past few years, we have had difficulty with this pathogen, but this year it looks like we are getting closer to good control with this. And then next, I'll talk about the primary thing that is killing our honeybees, which are the Varroa mites. As you can see, they are arachnids. They have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 legs. And they can be thought of, however, as most conveniently as a tick. So you can imagine if you had a tick that fed on you, the scale, it'd be about the size of a dinner plate. And they crawl around
as compared to a bee,
on bee to bee, and then reproduce on the honeybee brood.
Ooh.
Yeah. So you would probably not be feeling very productive or very healthy if you had a giant tick feeding on you.
A dinner plate sized tick,
a dinner plate sized tick. Yeah. Yeah.
Yikes.
And these mites, they go through a life just like everything else. And they have what's called a phoretic stage. And that is when they are outside of the bee brood cell and are feeding on the adult bees. And they go into a foundress phase where they are inside the brood cell with a developing bee, where they lay their eggs and produce offspring that go on to do the exact same thing. Part of the issue with this feeding behavior, and you can see the life cycle outlined here, where the mother mite is feeding on a bee. She goes into the cell with a larva. She lays her eggs. The larvae begin to hatch. The mites mate, and then she emerges now with herself and two healthy daughters. So you can see how that has an exponential buildup of mites within the colony. And if mites aren't managed properly, they do inevitably lead to the death of the colony.
And so does that kill the bee when it gets infected and it's like hatching more Varroa mites in it? Or is that the bee still living through the process?
It can indeed. And you'll see here some of the viruses that are passed on by these mites, such as deformed wing virus, which will lead to bees that emerge with, as you might suspect, deformed wings. And these bees with deformed wings, unfortunately, don't live very long and aren't productive at all. And just like mosquitoes spread diseases among humans, these mites are doing the exact same thing to the honeybees. They're transmitting viruses to the honeybees from host to host as they go around feeding in the colony, which substantially weakens the colony in addition to just the stress from their feeding behavior. And no, this is not coronavirus, by the way. This is deformed wing virus, and they're not related. I know they look similar. So here's a couple of those viruses that do pop up in the colonies. So here you can see that deformed wing virus. It's almost as if someone's grabbed the bee's wings and kind of rolled them up.
Yeah.
And down here you can see another virus called Foulbrood, because the larva's head turns into a hardened, tough, blackened scale, and the rest of the brood is a watery sac. We have black queen cell virus, which often kills developing queens, and then chronic bee paralysis virus, which leads to these mostly hairless, shiny black bees, which unfortunately, much like the deformed wing virus bees, do not live very long and are not productive for the colony. Viruses in combination with the mites really are a plague that beekeepers have been dealing with ever since the mites were accidentally introduced in the mid-1980s from China. So prior to the mid-1980s, these Varroa mites were not an issue at all. And it'd be nice to say that we've figured out how to manage these really efficiently since the mid-1980s, but unfortunately it's something that researchers, governments, and beekeepers are all still struggling with.
How's the Varroa mite situation in Utah this year, for example? Are you encountering a lot of hives that are, diseased with that, or is it?
Unfortunately, yes. We won't have numbers for this year for a little while. But looking back at 2019, it looks like beekeepers did a good job managing their mites into the fall. And that's really important because the bees are about to raise out the bees that are going to go through winter with the queen. And you want viral loads within the colony to be exceptionally low as you go into winter. And it's looking like this year we may have some mite loads that are a little bit higher. But again, we won't be able to say that with certainty until the data is actually compiled. But for beekeepers who are worried about pest and disease issues, so for bees, like I said, the biggest issues are those two Ps, which are pathogens and parasites. Beekeepers who are looking for resources or who would like to schedule an inspection with us can go to our website where there's tons of helpful info. I curated it myself, so I know it's all good. And you can also get in touch with your county bee inspector on there as well if you'd prefer to have them.
Yeah, and don't you do some of the county inspections or the state inspections?
Yeah. So if you'd like, you can call, and I'm available to come out and do an inspection with you, and I'll show you what we look for, as well as give you some tips on things that you might try to see better success.
That's so cool. And as you were saying on KRCL's Punk Rock Farmer last week, it's like $10 to register your hive, and everyone,
just
and
$10
that's
a year.
Yeah, and that's what
really
you get.
You
can get a whole, session with you or another state hive inspector to tell you how to keep your bees healthy. That's awesome.
Yeah, it really is great value for your money, and we really encourage beekeepers to make use of the service. So moving on to our native bees, we can see how our native bees can play an important role in pollination as well. Here we have bumblebees, and the reason I point out bumblebees and nightshades is because members of the nightshade family, such as tomatoes, are most efficiently pollinated by bumblebees, and that's because bumblebees can do what's called buzz pollination, where they have the strength to vibrate their wings at a specific frequency in order to get the pollen to release from the stamen. And honeybees actually don't do a very good job pollinating tomatoes. So you can actually see here in a hothouse, they're using bumblebees for pollination for the tomatoes. And this can actually be observed at Howling's Tomatoes down in Mona, Utah. They have a 30-acre greenhouse down there where they grow tomatoes. So if you go into your Smith's or your Costco and you look at the label on the tomatoes, they're very likely to say Howlings, and they were probably produced down at that facility, and I can guarantee they were pollinated by bumblebees. So that's an interesting way that bees, other than honeybees, are playing into your food supply.
Cool.
Another example of that would be bees and cows. So for those of us that enjoy dairy products and meat, the cows that we're eating or consuming milk products from are consuming the alfalfa that is grown throughout the state. But alfalfa needs to be reseeded every 3 to 4 years. And so there needs to be alfalfa seed produced. And in order to do that, the alfalfa needs to be efficiently pollinated, and that's best done by leafcutter bees. And the leafcutter bees are called that because they will cut out round sections of leaves and pack them into their nests and provision that with a little bit of pollen and an egg, and then they'll just stack those cocoons in a long column, and the next year the adult bees will emerge from those cocoons and go out and repeat the process. So without these guys, we wouldn't have efficient pollination of our alfalfa, and we wouldn't have all the delicious meats and cheeses that we see at the grocery store.
That'd be so sad if we didn't have that.
Yeah. I'm a sucker for cheese too, so
yeah, same here.
Really heartbroken. But going on beyond agriculture, just into our native bees, Utah is really a haven of bee biodiversity. So if we look at these two maps here we can see the southern half of the state of Utah compared to the entire eastern half of the United States. And we have about the same bee biodiversity in just the southern half of our state as there is in the entire eastern half of North America.
Wow.
So really it's an area where decisions that we make and steps that we take to help protect our managed and native pollinators really make a big difference here in Utah. So just to highlight some of our native bees that you may see out there. So this is Hesper apis. It's the western bee, is the common name. Hesperus means evening star in Greek, which is associated with the west, and then apis is Greek. You will find these guys primarily in southern Utah, but rather remarkably, they dig their nests 3 feet underground, which is pretty exceptional for a little bee just like this. These guys are sweat bees. Their name means stamen loving, by the way, and they're called sweat bees because they are attracted to sweat. And these are bees that you'll see quite frequently in southern Utah, particularly on rabbit brush when it's bloom. And then finally, we have carpenter bee here, which these guys are actually not in the exact same family as bumblebees, but you can see this one here is actually exhibiting an interesting behavior. It's doing what's called nectar robbing, where some flowers have these very long, thin petals because they're trying to be pollinated by a particular pollinator. However, some bees have figured out a little cheat where they can actually just chew a hole in the flower and stick their tongue through to get to the nectar, which is what's going on here, which is kind of a fun little thing. Oh, and it's named, by the way, just so you guys know, it is named in a logical way. Xylo is wood, Copa is worker, so this is the wood worker bee. Carpenter bees makes sense, right? So if we look at the health problems that our native bees are dealing with, they're the exact same 4 Ps, which are pathogens, pesticides, poor nutrition, and parasites. For any individual native bee that we look at, these factors are going to be playing, bigger or smaller roles depending on the species. However, as a general rule, you can be sure that the 4Ps are in some ways acting as stressors on those. A good example of that, or a good example of a pathogen that stresses many different bee species, would be chalkbrood here, which this is actually a fungus. And so for those of you who are familiar with fungi, the mycelial network, as it develops, consumes the larva and becomes a chalky-like brood. We call them mummies. And then as it goes black like this, that's when the fungus is actually sporulating. And so on a honeybee frame, here we can see how the larvae are consumed and are turned into these chalkbrood mummies. But the same thing happens with some of our native bees. So this is a leafcutter bee larva that has been infected with chalkbrood and consumed. And so we can see how these pathogens affect not only our honeybees, but our native bees as well. So moving on, we're going to talk about pesticide use, which is something that the average person can be aware of. I'm actually a big home gardener, and we try our best, at least I do, to implement IPM procedures. But sometimes you've got an ornamental that's near and dear to your heart that you just have to get the aphids off of. But I think there's some important things that we should remember when we go to use pesticides when it's necessary. And I actually like this quote here. Because it gets at how complacency or success can breed complacency. You've done something 100 times, you've never had any issues. This seems like common sense. You're just gonna, go ahead and do it. And this quote here, I'll read it to you guys, is, "I cannot imagine any condition which would cause a ship to founder. I cannot conceive of any vital disaster happening to this vessel. Modern shipbuilding has gone beyond that." Now, can you guess who might have said that?
Was that the Titanic guy?
It was indeed, yes. It was Captain Edward John Smith of the Titanic. And something that's interesting about the Titanic is that the Titanic was sailing at night through an area with known iceberg dangers. And they were actually trying to set a speed record, and Captain Smith was actually being pressured by his employer to set a speed record to show how fast these new ocean liners could be. And that's why they were traveling at full speed through the night through an area with known iceberg danger. And Captain Smith had a 40-year career with no significant incidents happening. So I think it's important to remember, just because something hasn't happened yet doesn't mean it never will. And just because you had success in the past doesn't mean you're immune to failures in the future. So when it comes to pesticides, I think each time we go to use them, we can remind ourselves that we can still cause problems through our negligence.
There was a terminology that you used. You said, I think you said IPM about pesticides. Is that?
Thank you. So that's
I'm not familiar with that.
People would be well advised, if you're concerned about responsible pesticide use, to go onto Utah State's website, where you can find information about IPM. Well, that's Integrated Pest Management, and that works on strategies where we go from our least severe response to our most severe response based on the level of issue that we're seeing there, right? So this works with things like herbicides as well as insecticides, etc. And they do go through processes to identify what the most appropriate response is for the pest issue that you're dealing with. Not only is it better for our environment, but it also can help save you some money. So bees and insecticides, obviously insecticides are what we're most concerned about when we look at issues with bees. Obviously they can cause both acute effects, which would be things like, large scale bee kills, as well as chronic effects, or things that affect the bee for the rest of its life. However, one thing that people are surprised to learn is that when we look at the actual data as far as pesticides that we're seeing inside of honeybee colonies, at least, the primary pesticide that shows up are these Varroa mites, which these are beekeeper applied pesticides to control those Varroa mites that we were talking about. We can actually see that neonicotinoids are a very small portion of what shows up, and then other insecticides obviously are that next portion. Likely they are responsible for some chronic effects in bee colonies. However, they're small enough that they are difficult to measure, and for beekeepers, definitely pesticides would rank, fourth or fifth on the list of issues that they're currently dealing with and issues that are perhaps leading to mortality. In fact, in Utah, it's hard for us to pin down cases where there's actually been a bee kill due directly to a given pesticide application. And part of that is because bee colonies are larger. Since they have, 60,000 individuals, they're able to absorb stressors a lot better. Unfortunately, the Varroa mites are a stressor that they are not equipped to adapt to. So what are the things that people can do if they are going to apply pesticides? Like I said, I'm an avid gardener. I use pesticides myself to get yield out of my plants and to protect some of my treasured ornamentals. And one thing that you can do is avoid applications to blooming plants. You'll want to cut all the blooms off of any plants near it, and then monitor those plants the next several weeks to make sure that they don't bloom again. And if they're getting close to blooming, you want to clip those blooms off.
Why is that?
Because if you're going to apply a pesticide to an area with no blooming plants, the risk to bees is very low because there's nothing blooming. Bees aren't attracted to that area. And so any bee landing in that area would be kind of a random occurrence. They don't have any desire to necessarily be in that area. So if plants in bloom must be sprayed, wait until evening. And that's because if there is any residual toxicity, that gives the entire night for that to die down before the morning comes and bees start to come out again for foraging. And then as always, don't allow pesticides to drift to non-target areas. And that's just, watching your wind speeds. If you start spraying something and you notice that, wind is blowing it far off of where you're trying to apply that, maybe pack it up for the evening and try again tomorrow when conditions are a little bit calmer. Also, follow the label. And this is actually probably the biggest thing that everyone can do to help with pesticide exposure, which is to read and follow the label. Please, I'm begging people. And then finally, the last thing to consider would be the weather. If you're applying a pesticide at lower temperatures, that means that the toxicity is going to last for a longer period of time. Cloud cover can mean lower UV exposure, which that can also lead to issues of longer residual toxicity. And then nights when dew is forecast are important because that can re-wet pesticides and again lead to longer residual toxicity. And then also keep in mind that weather can impact bee activity. So if it's colder or if there's cloud cover, then bees are unlikely to be out foraging. And then when it comes to formulations that we choose, we can stick to formulations that are less hazardous. So granular and pellet formulations are much less hazardous for bees. And that's because the bees don't have a good way to interact with them. And oftentimes they hit their target before the bees can come in contact with them. The most hazardous would be our dry flowables and our wettable powders. And that's because they can go onto the plants, they can have longer toxicity, as well as issues with them drying up. And the bees will sometimes gather up those powders as pollen and bring them back to their young, which you can see how that would be an issue.
Yeah.
So again, I'll beg everyone one more time, please just read and follow the label. Everything you need to know, believe it or not, is on there. If we could just get everybody to read and follow the label, the world would be a better place.
On so many levels, not just your pesticides, all of the labels.
Right. So what are other things beyond responsible pesticide use that the average homeowner can do to help protect Utah's managed as well as native bees? Number one, support Utah agriculture. As everybody here probably knows, buying local and supporting our local farmers not only helps Utah's economy, but also our native environment. So by all means, please support local Utah honey producers. That obviously is a big help to them. The next thing, helping protect our open spaces for both agricultural purposes as well as just open land for people and bees to enjoy. And just to give everybody some ideas. I've just got a few plants from my garden that are some of my favorites that the bees seem to enjoy a lot. And this one up here is Russian sage. This comes highly recommended for honeybees. And even if you prefer to not plant for honeybees, what I find is that my Russian sage tends to attract all of the honeybees, and the native bees are more drawn to all of my other flowers. So another one of my favorites here would be a blue flax. Gorgeous in the spring, has tons of these beautiful blue flowers. And all of these, by the way, are water-wise, save for my last example. This is just a purple penstemon. Utah has an amazing diversity of penstemons, so by all means, get some of those in your garden. Fern bush, another great one. Beautiful, small, white flowers. Once you've gotten it established, it needs very little water. And then finally, my personal favorite, I like to grow lots of hot peppers, so growing a vegetable garden is another great way to support bees. And if anyone would like to get in contact with me, by all means, here's my contact info. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Stephen. I learned a lot.
Yeah, you're welcome. Glad to do it.